She vanished into the back seat of a Korean Mafia boss's sedan to escape the man who owned her debt. He leaned back in the shadows, eyes like cold flint, and whispered, "He will not touch you again." I didn't know the man in the charcoal suit was the most feared criminal in the city. I only knew that the monster hunting me intended to trade my body to settle a gambling debt. If the idea of a woman escaping a predator only to land in the lap of a dragon makes your heart race, hit that like button. Subscribe right now and drop your city and time in the comments, because the choice I made in the next 10 seconds didn't just save my life, it started a war that would burn the city to the ground. The leather of the seat felt like a mockery of my skin, supple, unblemished, and expensive, while I sat there trembling. A plus-sized woman who had spent years trying to shrink herself into invisibility. My heart was a frantic bird battering against a cage of ribs as I watched Kyle's shadow pass the tinted window, his muffled rages vibrating through the glass. He was looking for the property he'd promised to a syndicate, but he couldn't see me. He couldn't see the man sitting inches away from me, whose presence felt like a physical weight, ancient and predatory. As the car pulled away, the silence was suffocating. I expected to be thrown out onto the asphalt, but instead the man, Jong-hun, never looked away from the window. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply watched the world as if he owned the very air we were breathing. When we arrived at the penthouse, the sheer scale of the fortress felt like another kind of trap. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked a city that had only ever offered me cold alleys and bruises. The air up here was thin, sterile, and smelled of sandalwood and power. I stood in the center of a living room that cost more than the sum of my entire life, clutching my threadbare shirt over my chest, feeling the heavy ache of the yellowing bruises on my arms. I was safe from Kyle, but a new, sharper terror began to bleed through my relief. I looked at the silent guards stationed at every exit, their faces carved from stone, their eyes never blinking. I moved toward the balcony just to see if the door was unlocked, but a hand, large, warm, and scarred, caught my wrist with terrifying precision. Jong-hun didn't pull me back, but he didn't let go either. He looked at my wrist, then up at my face, his expression unreadable. I realized then that the guards weren't watching the elevators to keep the world out. They were watching me. I was in a palace of gold and marble, but as Jong-hun's grip tightened just enough to be felt, the realization shattered my soul. I hadn't found a savior. I had simply been moved to a much more beautiful cage. The dragon hadn't rescued the lamb. He had claimed it. And as he leaned in, his breath ghosting against my ear, I wondered if the price of this protection was a debt I could never survive paying. The morning sun filtered through the high-rise windows of the penthouse, but it felt cold, like light hitting an iceberg. I sat on the edge of the oversized bed, my fingers tracing the soft, expensive silk of a robe that felt too light to be real. For 5 years, my mornings had been defined by the heavy, rhythmic thud of Kyle's boots and the sharp metallic scent of stale beer. Now there was only the hum of an air purifier and the terrifying weight of silence. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. I was still plus-sized, still black, still carrying the weight of 1,000 sorries I shouldn't have said, but the setting had changed from a basement dungeon to a palace of glass. My heart gave a violent lurch when the large television on the wall flickered to life. I hadn't touched the remote. It was as if the house itself was talking to me. A news anchor's voice, professional and detached, filled the room. Police are investigating a gruesome scene at a suburban warehouse. Early reports indicate a total massacre. Among the bodies identified is Kyle Vance, a local man with ties to illegal gambling. The screen flashed a grainy photo of Kyle, the man who had haunted my dreams, the man who had tried to sell me like a piece of livestock, was dead. I waited for the relief to wash over me. I waited for the tears of joy. Instead, a hollow, freezing dread settled in my marrow. Kyle was gone, but the manner of his exit felt like a dark omen. He hadn't just died, he had been erased. The door to the suite opened without a knock. Jung-hun stepped in, looking impeccable in a charcoal suit, the morning light catching the sharp angle of his jaw. He didn't look like a man who had just ordered a massacre. He looked like a man who had simply taken out the trash. I stood up, the silk robe slipping slightly off my shoulder, revealing a fading purple mark on my collarbone. "You killed him," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You didn't have to kill him. He was a monster, but why?" Jung-hun walked toward me, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped just inches away, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. He reached out, his thumb grazing the bruise on my shoulder, with a tenderness that felt more dangerous than a blow. "You think I killed him for revenge, Alicia?" His voice was a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to settle in my chest. "You think I did it for you?" I looked into his eyes, searching for a spark of heroics, but I found only a cold, terrifying clarity. "I didn't kill him because he hurt you," he said, his gaze never wavering. "I killed him because he committed the ultimate offense. He tried to sell what was already mine." The words felt like a physical strike. He wasn't my savior. He was a creditor. Kyle hadn't been punished for his cruelty. He had been executed for a breach of contract. Jung-hun leaned in closer, his scent of sandalwood and steel enveloping me, making me feel small and fragile in a way Kyle never could. "Kyle didn't owe the Iron Lotus," Jung-hun whispered, his eyes darkening. "He owed me, and in his desperation, he offered me the only thing he had left that carried any value." My breath hitched as the realization shattered my remaining hope. "What did he offer you?" Jung-hun's hand moved from my shoulder to the back of my neck, his grip firm but not painful, a silent claim of ownership. "Everything," he murmured. He turned to leave, pausing at the doorway without looking back. "Rest, Alicia. You're going to need your strength. The debt Kyle left behind wasn't just money. It was your life. And I have no intention of letting a single cent go to waste." The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the vast, beautiful silence. I looked back at the screen, at Kyle's lifeless face, and then at the locked door. I was safe from the monster who hated me, but I was now the prize of a king who viewed my soul as a line item on a ledger. I had escaped the fire, only to find myself drowning in a deep, dark ocean, and as the sun climbed higher, I realized I didn't even know if I was a guest, a ghost, or a piece of gold in his vault. The dining room was a cathedral of cold marble and sharp edges, lit by a chandelier that dripped like frozen tears. I sat at the far end of a mahogany table that felt like a mile of distance between me and the man who had claimed my life. Before me sat a feast that looked more like a painting than a meal, succulent meats, vibrant greens, and delicate grains, but my stomach was a knotted fist. For years, my relationship with food had been a battleground. Kyle had used my weight as a tether to keep me grounded in shame, mocking every bite I took while simultaneously demanding I cook for him until my hands burned. I had learned to eat in the dark, in the bathroom, or not at all, trying to shrink my body so he would have less of me to hit. I picked at a single grain of rice, my movements so small they were almost invisible. I kept my head down, my eyes fixed on the white porcelain, waiting for the inevitable sharp comment about my greed or the space I was taking up in this beautiful room. I was a stain on his perfection, and I knew it. But the air didn't crack with an insult. Instead, the heavy silver of Jung-hun's fork clattered softly against his plate. "Eat, Alicia," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards and into my bones. "You are safe here. In this house, hunger is a choice you no longer have to make." I looked up, my eyes stinging. I'm not that hungry," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "I don't want to be a burden. I know I already take up too much room." Jung-hun stood up, his presence swallowing the light. He walked the length of the table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, until he stood directly behind me. I braced myself, my shoulders hunching toward my ears, waiting for the blow or the rejection. Instead, he leaned down, his warmth radiating through the thin silk of my robe. He didn't touch my skin, but he placed his hands on the back of my chair, effectively boxing me in with his strength. "The man who taught you to starve yourself is a ghost," he whispered, his breath warm against the shell of my ear. "He wanted you small so he could feel tall. But I am already a giant, Alicia. You cannot crowd me." He reached around and pushed the plate closer to me, his dark eyes locking onto mine in the reflection of the wineglass. "Take up the space you were born to occupy. I didn't bring you here to watch you vanish." I took a bite, the flavors exploding against a tongue that had forgotten how to taste joy. It felt like a betrayal to the woman I had been, the woman who survived by disappearing. Tears finally broke, hot and silent, dripping into the expensive sauce. I felt his hand hover near my hair, a gesture of comfort he seemed to be fighting against, before he pulled away. "You think this is a fresh start?" he said, his tone suddenly turning as sharp as a razor. The tenderness was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity that made my heart stop. "You think I saw a girl in trouble and felt pity?" I wiped my face with the back of my hand, my voice trembling. "Didn't you?" Jung-hoon walked back to his seat, but he didn't sit. He looked out the window at the sprawling city lights, his silhouette a dark, jagged edge against the sky. "I knew your name before you ever stepped into my car, Alicia. I knew about the burner phone. I knew about the debt. I even knew which coffee brand Kyle used to punish you for." He turned back to me, and the twist in his expression made my blood run cold. "I didn't find you by accident in that garage. I was waiting for you. The only question is, why did I wait 3 years to finally let you in?" He left the room before I could scream the question back at him. I sat alone in the silence, the delicious food now turning to lead in my stomach. He had been watching me suffer for years. He had watched the bruises bloom and fade, watched the hunger, watched the fear, and he had done nothing until I was worth a transaction. I looked at the empty doorway, a terrifying realization hollowing me out. If he had been watching me that long, did he save me because he wanted me? Or because I was the final piece in a game I didn't even know was being played? The morning air was crisp, but the atmosphere inside the black SUV felt like a controlled explosion waiting to happen. Jong-hun sat beside me, his presence a silent wall of obsidian. He hadn't spoken since our breakfast confrontation, yet he had summoned a team of stylists to drape me in a simple, elegant silk dress that hugged my curves rather than hiding them. We pulled up to a high-end boutique where the mannequins in the window looked more welcomed than I felt. I stepped onto the plush carpet, my skin prickling under the immediate, cold scrutiny of a sales assistant whose smile didn't reach her eyes. She looked at my skin, then at the width of my hips, and stepped forward not to greet me, but to block my path to the rack of designer gowns. "I'm afraid we don't carry anything in your proportions," she said, her voice a polished blade of condescension. "Perhaps there is a shop in the lower district more suited to your needs?" The familiar poison of shame rose in my throat, hot and thick. It was the same look Kyle used to give me, the look that said I was a glitch in a beautiful world, a mistake that needed to be moved out of sight. I began to apologize, the reflex of a victim ready to retreat into the shadows, but a heavy hand settled on the small of my back. Jong-hoon stepped forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply pulled a black titanium card from his pocket and laid it on the glass counter with a soft, lethal click. "I don't want to buy a dress," Jong-hoon murmured, his eyes fixed on the woman until she physically withered. "I want to buy the building. And I want you to spend your last hour of employment ensuring that this woman is treated like the queen she is. If a single thread she touches is deemed out of her proportions again, I will ensure your career is as empty as this store is about to be." As the staff scrambled in a panic of forced smiles and trembling hands, I felt a strange, terrifying rush of dignity. For the first time in my life, someone had stood in the gap between me and my own self-loathing. But as I stood in the dressing room, surrounded by silks that felt like water, I caught a glimpse of the manager through the curtain. She was on a burner phone, her voice a frantic whisper, her eyes darting toward the street where a black van had just pulled up. She wasn't just a rude clerk. She was watching us with the predatory hunger of a scout. Jong-hun caught my eye in the mirror as he leaned against the doorframe, watching me realize the truth. He wasn't here to play Prince Charming. He had used my need for dignity as the perfect piece of bait. He knew the Iron Lotus had spies in this district, and he had just shouted our location to the world using a credit card and a scene. He had restored my pride only to use it as a lure for a bloodbath. As the first window of the boutique shattered and the screams began, I looked at the man who had just defended me and realized that even his kindness was a weapon. He had given me the world just to see who would try to take it from him, and as the bullets began to fly, I wondered if he had ever intended for me to survive the shopping trip at all. The chaos of the boutique had been scrubbed away, replaced by the suffocating opulence of the penthouse. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, wandering through corridors of glass and shadows until I found myself in Jong-hun's private study. The room smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. A manila folder sat on the center of his desk, stark and inviting, as if it had been left there specifically for me to find. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting to find the legalities of the boutique purchase. Instead, I found a ledger from the Iron Lotus Syndicate, a cold, numerical record of human misery. My name was there, typed in a font so clinical it made my skin crawl. Beneath it was the total of Kyle's debt, followed by a series of dates and stamps that indicated my life had been settled. But as I flipped the page, my breath died in my lungs. Tucked behind the ledger was a photograph. It wasn't a recent surveillance shot from the garage. It was a candid photo of me from 3 years ago, standing at a bus stop in the rain, looking exhausted and broken, long before I even knew Kyle was gambling our lives away. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Jong-hun hadn't just chanced upon me. He had been stalking my tragedy for years. He had watched me wither under Kyle's hand, watched me shrink, watched me cry. And he had waited until the very moment I was at my most disposable to step in. Was I a woman he cared for, or was I a long-term investment that had finally matured? I didn't hear him enter. I only felt the air change, the sudden drop in temperature that always signaled his presence. "You were never supposed to look in there, Alicia," he said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. I turned, clutching the photo to my chest, my eyes burning with a mixture of betrayal and a desperate, fragile hope. "You've been watching me for 3 years," I choked out, the words feeling like shards of glass. "You watched him hit me. You watched me starve. Why now? Why did you wait until I was being sold to finally open the car door?" Jong-hun didn't flinch. He walked toward me, his shadow stretching across the floor until it swallowed mine. He reached out, taking the photo from my trembling fingers, his gaze lingering on my younger, sadder face. "I needed to see if you would break," he whispered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something raw and agonizing in his eyes. "The Iron Lotus doesn't want your body, Alicia. They wanted to use you to get to me. They knew I was watching. They knew you were the only thing in this city that could make a man like me hesitate." He stepped closer, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a possessiveness that made me want to scream and melt at the same time. "Are you my savior?" I whispered, my heart breaking under the weight of the ambiguity. "Or did you just buy the one thing your enemies could use to kill you?" He didn't answer. He only looked at the ledger, then at me, the silence between us growing into a vast, unbridgeable canyon. He had settled the debt, but as he turned and walked out, leaving me standing in the dark of his office, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. The ledger was closed, but the transaction was far from over. I was safe from the world, but I was trapped in a mystery that had started years before I even knew his name, and the man who held the key was the only one I was now terrified to trust. The study was thick with the scent of sulfur and old blood as the fireplace roared, its orange light dancing across Jong-hun's face like a mask of ancient gold. I stood by the desk, my heart a jagged stone in my throat, watching him hold the manila folder, the physical evidence of my life being traded like a commodity. Without a word, he tossed the ledger into the flames. I watched my name curl and blacken, the clinical record of my worth as collateral turning into ash that floated up the chimney. It should have felt like a release, but as the paper crumbled, the silence in the room became heavy with a new kind of dread. "That debt is gone, Alicia," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "You owe the Iron Lotus nothing. You owe the world nothing." I looked at the fire, tears blurring the embers. Then why do I still feel like I'm waiting for the bill to arrive? Why did you keep that photo for 3 years, Jong-hun? You watched me break, piece by piece, just so you could buy the ruins. He stepped toward me, his shadow eclipsing the warmth of the fire. Before he could answer, the heavy oak doors groaned open. Director Min, Jong-hun's second-in-command, a man with eyes like stagnant water and a smile that never reached his soul, stepped into the light. He didn't look at me with the reverence the other guards did. He looked at me with the cold, calculating hunger of a man looking at a piece of meat. "A gift has arrived from our friends in the Lotus," Min said, his voice oozing a false, oily politeness. He placed a small, tattered velvet box on the desk. Jong-hun opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of stained white satin, was a cheap, gold-plated wedding ring. I felt the air leave my lungs. I recognized the scratches on the band, the way the metal was slightly warped from when Kyle had slammed his fist onto the table while wearing it. It was the ring he had pawned 3 months ago to pay for a losing streak, the same ring he told me he had lost while working late. "They found it in the pocket of a dead man," Min whispered, his gaze sliding toward me, sharp and mocking. "But they sent a message with it. They say a debt isn't settled just because the paper is burned. They say you've taken something that belongs to the syndicate, and they're coming to reclaim their property." Min leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that Jong-hun ignored, but I felt in my marrow. "You're a beautiful distraction, Alicia. But do you know what we call a woman who sits at the center of a war? We call her bait. Jong-hun isn't burning ledgers for love. He's burning them to draw the snakes out of the grass." "And you are the most tempting thing he's ever held over the pit." The room tilted. I looked at Jong-hun, searching for a denial, for a spark of the man who had told me I was allowed to take up space. But he was staring at the pawned ring, his jaw tight, his expression a fortress I couldn't breach. The twist in Min's words settled into my chest like a poison. Min wasn't just warning me, he was gloating. The way he glanced at his phone, the subtle shift in his posture toward the door. It felt like he was waiting for a signal. "Is it true?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Am I just the lure?" Jong-hun finally looked at me, but for the first time his eyes were unreadable, filled with a darkness that made the fire seem cold. "Director Min, leave us," he commanded. As Min backed away, he flashed me one final, jagged smile, the look of a man who had already sold the secret of the penthouse's back entrance. I was standing in a room with a man who might be using my soul as a shield, while his right hand was likely sharpening the knife for my back. The gap between safety and sacrifice had vanished, leaving me standing on the edge of a cliff, wondering if the man who caught me would be the one to finally push me over. The gala was a sea of shimmering silk and predatory smiles, a neutral ground where the city's most dangerous bloodlines came to clink crystal glasses. I moved through the ballroom like a ghost in a gown of midnight blue, the fabric heavy and cooling against my skin, but my heart was a frantic drum. Jong-hun walked beside me, his hand resting at the small of my back, a touch that felt less like a support and more like a claim. Every eye in the room was a needle, stitching me into a narrative I didn't understand. I was the black woman on the arm of the dragon, the collateral that had supposedly started a cold war, and the weight of their judgment was a physical pressure against my lungs. "Keep your head up, Alicia," Jung-hoon murmured, his voice barely a breath against the ambient hum of the orchestra. You are not a guest here. You are the reason they are afraid to speak. But I wasn't afraid of their whispers. I was afraid of the silence. I scanned the room, my trauma-honed instincts, the ones that had kept me alive in a basement for 5 years, screaming that something was wrong. I noticed a waiter weaving through the crowd, his movements too jagged, his eyes never settling on the trays of champagne. My breath hitched. I recognized the slope of his shoulders, the way he carried himself with the desperate, twitchy energy of a man who had lost everything at the card tables. He was one of Kyle's old associates, a man named Marcus, who had once watched Kyle drag me by my hair and had simply turned up the volume on the television. My eyes followed the line of his gaze, up toward the darkened velvet curtains of the mezzanine. A tiny metallic glint caught the light, a sniper's lens. Jung-hoon! The name ripped from my throat as a primal instinct overrode my fear. I didn't think about the bait theory or the ledger. I only thought about the man who told me I was allowed to take up space. I lunged forward, my body a shield, throwing my weight into him just as the first shot shattered the air. The sound was a deafening crack that turned the ballroom into a symphony of screams. We went down together, the cold marble floor slamming into my shoulder. I felt the heat of a bullet graze the air where his head had been a second before. Panicked footsteps thundered around us as the lights cut out, plunging the world into a terrifying starlit chaos. In the darkness, Jung-hoon's arms wrapped around me, pulling me beneath the cover of a heavy oak table. His heart was racing against my ear, a frantic human rhythm that broke through his icy exterior. For a heartbeat, there was no Mafia boss, no syndicate, only 2 people breathing in the dark. You stayed, he whispered. His voice cracked with a shock that bordered on agony. I gave you the opening to run, Alicia. Why did you stay? I looked at him, tears stinging my eyes, my hand trembling as I touched the charcoal fabric of his suit, searching for blood. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't hiding from the monster, I whispered. I was protecting the only thing that made me feel like I existed. He stared at me, his expression fracturing in the dim light, a look of profound, terrifying realization dawning on his face. He reached out, his fingers tangling in my hair, his forehead resting against mine as the sounds of gunfire echoed in the distance. But before he could speak, the doors to the ballroom were kicked open. It wasn't the police. It was Director Min, flanked by men in the crimson ties of the Iron Lotus. Min didn't look for the sniper. He looked directly at us, a jagged, triumphant smile cutting through the smoke. The gap between us widened as the realization took hold. The sniper hadn't been meant to kill Jung-hoon. He had been meant to test me. And as Marcus, the waiter, stood behind Min with a cold, hollow grin, I realized the man who had seen my suffering for years wasn't done playing with my soul. Jung-hoon's grip on me tightened until it hurt, and I couldn't tell if he was holding me to keep me safe or because he finally knew exactly how much I was willing to lose for him. The rain at the docks didn't fall. It punished. It turned the salt air into a thick gray veil that tasted of rusted iron and impending death. We were surrounded, trapped between the towering skeletal remains of shipping containers that looked like the tombstones of a forgotten city. The Iron Lotus had turned the shipyard into a kill box. Jung-hoon pushed me behind a stack of steel crates, his breathing heavy, his once immaculate suit torn and stained with the grime of the struggle. For the first time, the invincible dragon looked mortal. His hand, steady as a mountain for years, was trembling as he pulled a cold, heavy pistol from his waistband and pressed it into my palms. "Take it, Alicia," he rasped, his voice cutting through the mechanical groan of the nearby cranes. "There is a small hatch beneath the floorboards of the 3rd container to the left. It leads to the drainage pipes. You run, and you do not look back. Not for the sounds, and not for me." "No," I choked out, the metal of the gun freezing against my skin. "I'm not leaving you here to die for a debt that was never yours. You told me I was allowed to take up space." How can I take up space in a world where you don't exist? Jong-hun's eyes softened, a devastating crack appearing in his granite exterior. He reached out, his thumb catching a stray tear on my cheek, mixing it with the rain. I spent 3 years watching you survive a slow death, Alicia. I won't watch you suffer a fast one. You are the only beautiful thing I've ever owned that wasn't stolen. Now go. He didn't wait for my answer. He stood, stepping out into the line of fire to draw their attention, his silhouette a lone, defiant spark against the encroaching shadows of the Lotus soldiers. I ran. My heart was a frantic, bleeding thing in my chest as I scrambled toward the third container, my boots slipping on the oil-slicked concrete. I found the hatch, my fingernails tearing as I clawed at the rusted metal, but as I pulled it open, the safety I had been promised vanished. There, standing in the darkness of the pipe's entrance, was Director Min. He wasn't alone. He held a detonator in one hand and a radio in the other, his face twisted into a mask of pure, ecstatic betrayal. "The hatch was always the trap, Alicia," Min whispered, his voice hissed over the roar of the wind. "Jong-hun is a fool for love, but I am a student of profit. The Iron Lotus didn't want the collateral back. They wanted the dragon to hand himself over to save a nobody like you." I looked back at Jong-hun, who was being forced to his knees by a dozen men, his eyes desperately searching the darkness for the sight of my escape. He thought I was safe. He was surrendering his life to a lie. Min stepped forward, the barrel of his own weapon glinting in the dark. "He thinks he's saving his queen," Min laughed, "but he's just dying for a ghost." I looked at the gun in my hand, then at the massive industrial crane looming directly above Min's head, its heavy iron hook swaying like a pendulum of fate. The emotional gap was a yawning abyss. Could I become the monster I needed to be to save the man who had taught me I was worth saving? Or was I destined to be the bait that finally caught the dragon? The metal of the industrial crane felt like the hand of a vengeful god beneath my fingers. From the high cab, the world below was a blur of shadows and muzzle flashes, but my eyes were locked on Director Min. He stood over Jong-hun, the detonator glinting in his hand, a man who had built a career on selling out those who trusted him. I saw Jong-hun's face, not the mask of the Mafia boss, but the raw, bleeding face of the man who had waited 3 years to save me. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine across the abyss, silent and pleading for me to run. But I was done running. I was done shrinking. I pulled the heavy lever with every ounce of the strength I had once used to survive Kyle's blows. The massive iron hook didn't just swing, it screamed. The sound of shifting steel drowned out Min's final cry as the heavy crate slammed down, pinning the traitor and his lies beneath tons of unforgiving metal. The silence that followed was more deafening than the gunfire. I climbed down the ladder, my legs shaking, my breath coming in jagged sobs that tore at my throat. I stumbled toward Jong-hun through the settling dust. He rose from his knees, his face smeared with blood and oil, and for a moment we just stood there, two broken things that had somehow found a way to bridge the gap. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and pulled me into his chest, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against mine. I felt his tears on my neck, hot and silent, a baptism that washed away the last of the collateral I had been forced to be. When we returned to the penthouse, the air was different. The gilded cage felt like a foundation. Jong-hun didn't go to his desk or reach for his glass of whiskey. He walked to a small safe behind a portrait of a dragon and pulled out a heavy black velvet box. My breath hitched. I expected jewelry, a necklace to mark me as his property, or a bracelet to bind me. But when the lid clicked open, I saw a heavy gold ring set with a flat black onyx stone, bearing the intricate crest of his family. It was a signet ring, a symbol of absolute authority, a key to an empire that people lived and died to serve. "I promise to protect you, Alicia," he said, his voice rough with an emotion so deep it felt like it was being pulled from his soul. He took my hand, his fingers tracing the scars on my knuckles from the crane. But I was wrong. You don't just need a shield, you need the sword. He slid the heavy ring onto my finger. It was a perfect fit, a weight that grounded me to the earth. You are not my mistress, and you are no one's debt. You are my equal, the Queen of the Iron Lotus. He handed me a stack of legal documents, his eyes burning with a fierce, quiet pride. As I looked down, I saw the signatures. He hadn't just settled my debt. He had legally transferred every seized asset of the Iron Lotus into my name. The warehouses, the accounts, the very ground the syndicate stood on. It was all mine. I looked at the black stone on my hand, then at the man who had dismantled his own hierarchy to crown me. I wasn't the trembling woman hiding in a back seat anymore. I was the one who owned the car, the driver, and the road. I stood at the window, looking out at the city that had once tried to swallow me whole. I had found my power, but as Jong-hun stood behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder, I felt the chilling weight of the crown. I was finally free, but at what cost? I had traded a basement for an empire, but in this world, every throne is built on a graveyard. I shared my soul with you today, letting you see the bruises and the blood it took for a woman like me to finally be seen. Don't be like the people who watched me suffer for years and did nothing. Show me that my survival matters to you. Subscribe now and drop your city and time in the comments. Thank you.